Media Relations Bureau for Fairfax County Police Department. This morning, Chief Rossler is going to be addressing the investigation into an in-custody death last night. We're also here from Acting Fire Chief John Cosson, who will also be speaking. This is our Internal Affairs Major, Jervis Reed, who is conducting and leading the administrative investigation into what happened last night. And over here is Major Rich Perez, who is head of our Major Crimes Bureau, who's conducting the criminal investigation, the routine criminal investigation. We'll also be providing you a handout at the end to make sure that you have the most accurate, up-to-date information. We know you have a lot of questions at this point, and we are working to answer those. So without further ado, here's Chief Rossler.
Good morning. Before we get started, I want to offer my prayers on behalf of all the first responders, to the Paul family, our community, and those first responders that were on the scene of this tragic loss of life. Our goal as first responders is to preserve the sanctity of all human life. And as you listened to my briefing, that was our goal throughout this entire event. On June 26th at 4:32 p.m., Fairfax County received a 911 call for an overdose in the 4300 block of Mission Court in the Alexandria section of Fairfax County. The initial two officers who arrived on the scene were both trained in crisis intervention team training and mental health awareness. One of our officers that initially responded to the scene had an active body-worn camera that was live. The first two officers found Mr. Paul experiencing a medical and/or mental health episode. The officers used their crisis intervention training in order to help de-escalate Mr. Paul's behavior as he was actively trying to harm himself. As they were trying to de-escalate Mr. Paul's behavior, Mr. Paul, on his own accord, caused himself to fall to the floor. At this time, the officers seized the opportunity to safely move in and restrain Mr. Paul as he was a threat to himself by his own physical actions. This was done by first handcuffing Mr. Paul and then using a nylon supplemental restraining device to stop his legs from violently kicking. As a matter of policy, the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue medics staged outside the home. When Mr. Paul was brought under control, the medics were then called in to provide a medical assessment of Mr. Paul. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Cosson to talk about what that medical assessment is and how we then move Mr. Paul to a hospital. Chief?
Thank you, Chief Rossler. And on behalf of all the men and women of Fairfax County Fire and Rescue, I want to echo Chief Rossler's sentiments to the Paul family. Our condolences. As Chief Rossler said, our units from the Franconia and Pendle stations staged until the scene was under control by our police counterparts, upon which the scene was declared stable. Our providers accessed the patient, provided patient care per protocol, and then furthermore transferred the patient to the medic unit and transported to the emergency department at Alexandria Hospital.
Unfortunately, Mr. Paul was pronounced dead at the hospital. There were 6 involved officers on the scene. 5 of those officers are from the Franconia District Station, and 1 of the officers was from the Mount Vernon District Station, which is the neighboring station. The body-worn camera footage at this time will not be released by me. Eventually, I will release the body-worn camera footage when it no longer jeopardizes the integrity of the investigation. This concludes my statement. I'll entertain a few questions. Please realize I cannot get into the details of an active criminal and administrative investigation. This is rapidly unfolding. We have many interviews yet to conduct, and we will be as transparent as possible as this investigation progresses, and I will fully hold us accountable to that transparency.
Chief, can you talk a little bit more about what happened in between the time the man fell on the ground and the time that he was helped by the medics? Were any tasers used? Were any guns used? Or was it just him on the ground, them restraining him? Can you kind of walk us through that?
At this time, it's an active criminal investigation, but with a level of confidence, I can say that no physical use of force was used against Mr. Paul, nor were any other type of weapons used against him.
Was the crisis mobilization team called, or any mental health professionals called to the scene?
This rapidly unfolded once the officers got onto the scene, and both of them, as I stated, one was certified in crisis intervention team training. The other one was trained in mental health awareness. I can, with a level of assurance, tell the community they used their de-escalation skills to try to help Mr. Paul de-escalate his irrational behavior. And again, Mr. Paul, on his own accord, the officers had no contact with him. He was trying to harm himself. He fell on the floor, and the officers had an opportunity to then take him into custody to prevent himself from self-harm.
Chief, so you're saying that they were not called, the mobilization team was not called. Why was that? Why
I can't answer that question right now. We're still conducting the investigation to see what was unfolding. This was a live, active, instantaneous event. It was initially dispatched as an overdose. It was something different when we got there because of the physical behavior. It rapidly unfolded. So I can't fully answer that right now until we conduct the investigation thoroughly.
The initial
Yes.
call.
Can you give us a timeline from 4:32 until he was at the hospital? How long did the encounter occur? When exactly was he transported to the hospital? How long did it take?
We're working on the time chronology, and we will update you. Again, this is rapidly unfolding. We're looking at different databases to narrow down the exact times of arrival and then transport. So I don't have that available right now. We will update you.
So Chief, you mentioned that his legs were secured with plastic ties.
No, they were not plastic ties. It was a nylon restraining device. We will give you a handout with a photograph of the exact item, which is right here.
So does that mean that his movement were assisted, or was it on his own?
I'm not understanding your question.
If his legs were secured, obviously his movement either had to be assisted or non-assisted. So I guess the question is, how was he able to move either to get into the squad car? Was it assisted by?
He wasn't put in a squad car. As we described, the officers controlled him with handcuffs and the restraining device. Then the paramedics came in to medically assess him, and then he was then transported on a stretcher in an ambulance to the hospital. Yes,
Two
sir.
questions. First off, can you describe at what point his condition started to deteriorate, and were extra steps taken once that happened? And second of all, the tweet said that the call went out as a domestic abuse call. So can you help us understand that?
The information after that tweet is initial dispatch was an overdose, so that was in error. I've verified the initial call. Repeat the first part of your question, sir.
At what point did his condition start to deteriorate, and how did and maybe the fire chief can explain this. At what point, what happened? Did he stop breathing? Did he have a heart attack? What sort of stuff did you do to help him?
So the medical examiners conducted an autopsy that started this morning, so I don't have the proximate cause of death until the autopsy is completed, the criminal investigation is done. I can tell you that as the medics were assessing Mr. Paul, he went into a medical emergency. So until the medical examiner completes his or her findings, I don't have the answer.
Well, a bit, sorry, but just a follow-up if you don't mind. The chief can probably describe what actions his medics took. Did he do? Was it a cardiac resuscitation? Was he choking on something? And maybe the chief can elaborate. And realizing that the medical examiner will make the final determination.
Actually, I can't elaborate too much because we're talking about personal medical information. But rest assured that our paramedics completed their assessment per protocol, and treated the patient based on the signs and symptoms that he presented.
Chief, did any of your officers find any drugs at the scene? Do we know what this man might have been taking if he was on any sorts of drugs?
It's an active investigation, and I can't comment on anything such as your question poses.
Well, can you
Sorry.
tell us about the injured family member that was in the original narrative who was outside the home?
I can assure you from my professional perspective, this was not a domestic. It was someone suffering either a medical and or mental health episode, and in my professional opinion, it does not fit the criteria of a domestic assault.
So was there not a family member who was injured, who was outside the home, that was put out? I mean, in your release, that's the narrative that went out, that there was somebody outside the home who was injured, had a head injury. And is that not the case? Was that also incorrect information?
That's correct information, but it doesn't rise to the level, in my professional opinion, of a domestic assault, based upon the information I now know.
Okay,
All right,
so
one
how-
more question, Justin.
Chief,
Well-
can you explain how your officers tried to de-escalate the situation?
Verbally, and they tried to gain control of him verbally, and he was actively causing harm to himself and fell to the floor, and that's when they seized the opportunity.
How
It
was
happened
How was
quickly.
he causing harm to himself?
He was trying to hurt himself physically by thrashing himself, throwing himself to the ground.
All right, thank you guys for coming out. We do have a flyer that has a picture of the restraining device and also details how long the 6 officers have each been on the department and what station they're out of. So,
Thank you.